In the early 1980s, a man sits down with the Los Angeles Times and reads a story he couldn't shake. The article described a young man from a Southeast Asian refugee family. They had escaped, by some accounts, from Cambodia, from the killing fields, and resettled in the United States. And their son started having nightmares. These nightmares were so terrifying, they made him afraid to close his eyes. He told his family that something was coming for him in his dreams, that if he fell asleep, it would get him. So he fought it. He stayed up. He drank coffee. He paced the house. He did everything he could to keep his eyes open because he truly believed that if he fell asleep, he would die. His family eventually convinced him to take some sleeping pills. He couldn't go on like this, and at some point, the exhaustion won. He went to his room, he fell asleep, and in the middle of the night, his family heard screaming. By the time they reached him, he was dead. The man reading that story set down the newspaper and couldn't stop thinking about it. Eventually, he did something with it. But for now, a doctor at the Centers for Disease Control opened a file on his desk and read something that didn't make sense. 38 young men who were healthy, strong, with no history of illness had simply gone to bed and never woke up. No drugs, no poison, no signs of struggle, no evidence of anything at all, just death in the middle of the night during their sleep. But the strangest part wasn't how they died, it was the moments just before. Witnesses said that they were gasping, they were shouting, screaming, like they were trapped in something. One unexplained death in sleep is unusual, two is maybe a coincidence, right? But over 100? That is a serious pattern. By the late 80s, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had documented 117 cases. All men, most of which were dying in their sleep. Even after years of investigation, they still can't explain why. But what they uncovered didn't just confuse doctors, it sparked an international obsession that wouldn't go away. But we'll get to that. So, in the late 1970s, the US started taking huge numbers of refugees from Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and these are people who have been living through hell. We're talking about the Khmer Rouge, the bombing of Laos, the fall of Saigon. They've lost homes, they lost family members, and they watched their entire worlds collapse. And now they're starting over from scratch in places like Minneapolis, Fresno, and Long Beach. Starting over in cities where nobody really speaks their language, nobody truly understands what they've survived, and in a lot of cases, nobody really wants them there. And most of them, they're doing exactly what you'd expect to do in a new environment. They have their heads down, they're learning English, desperately wanting to find some kind of work, trying to build something. These people were mostly young, in their mid-20s to mid-30s, and by every medical standard, they were healthy. These people endured violence, they survived it, and made it to a new land. These aren't people with long medical histories. They're young men in the prime of their lives, doing the hardest thing they've ever had to do. They went to work, they came home, they went to bed, and then something went wrong. It started with scattered reports, a coroner in California, a medical examiner in Minnesota, a confused ER doctor in Texas. Each one independently encountered the same thing. A young Southeast Asian man found dead in bed with zero explanation. These deaths were almost always the same. The victim went to sleep apparently fine, but somewhere in the night between 10 p.m. and 8 in the morning, something happened. In the cases where someone else was in the room, what they described was terrifying. The man would begin gasping, he'd begin groaning and sometimes screaming, his body would tense up, and then in minutes, sometimes seconds, he was dead. By the time paramedics arrived, there was nothing to do, and when doctors ordered autopsies, they found nothing. No blocked arteries, no blood clots, no brain bleeds, no overdoses, no structural damage of any kind. The organs looked healthy, the toxology came back clean, and every test said the person should still be alive. At first, each case was treated as a strange one-off, like a tragic anomaly, but the CDC had started connecting reports, and when they laid them side by side, a picture emerged that was very hard to ignore. Nearly every victim was male, every victim was young, every victim was Southeast Asian, and nearly every single one of them died in their sleep. By 1981, the CDC had documented 38 cases. The crude death rate among Southeast Asian men that year hit 10.2 per 100,000. a number high enough that random chance wasn't a serious explanation anymore. Something was killing these men in their sleep, and nobody had any idea what it was. So the CDC does what the CDC does. They opened a formal surveillance program. They started tracking every case they could find: age, sex, ethnicity, time of death, autopsy results, and their circumstances. And the more data they collected, the stranger the picture got. These deaths weren't slowing down. By the early 80s, they were at their peak, and it didn't really matter where these refugees had resettled. California, Minnesota, Texas, Oregon, different cities, different climates, different everything. The only thing these victims had in common was where they came from. Whatever was killing them wasn't in their environment. It made the trip with them. As researchers started looking overseas for answers, they found out that communities in Southeast Asia actually had a name for this issue. In Thailand, they called it Lai Tai, meaning sudden death in sleep. In the Philippines, they had Bang Wut Wut. In Japan, they called it Pukari. Not to be confused with the high-soled sandal, each name is slightly different and in each culture with its own framework for understanding it. But they're all describing the same thing: sudden death while sleeping with no explanation. In northeast Thailand alone, researchers would eventually calculate the incidence rate of roughly 38 per 100,000 men between the ages of 20 and 49 per year. That made dying in your sleep one of the leading causes of death for young men in that region, and that's terrifying. This has been happening for a very long time. The refugee crisis hadn't created it, it just made it visible to Western medicine for the first time. But those displaced communities had their own explanation of what was happening, one that most American doctors weren't really interested in hearing. In Hmong tradition, across several Southeast Asian cultures, there is a belief in a nocturnal entity, a spirit that visits you during sleep. It presses on your chest, it steals your breath, and it paralyzes you. If y'all ever experienced sleep paralysis, then you'll have some idea of what this feels like. That terrifying moment where you're half awake, but your body won't move, and you feel like a presence is in the room that you can't see clearly, but you almost certainly know is there. Now, imagine that experience being filtered through a belief system that tells you that this presence is real, and it can kill you if the proper rituals haven't been performed. If the right protections aren't in place, you will die. For these refugees, many of those protections were gone. The healers, the ceremonies, the community structures that had guarded against this kind of spiritual threat for generations, all of them were shattered by war and displacement. These people were living in unfamiliar cities, often isolated, and very much afraid to talk about what they were experiencing because they didn't think Americans would understand. And most of them were terrified to fall asleep. Men in these communities were doing everything they could to stay awake, drinking coffee, pacing back and forth, keeping the lights on, because they really genuinely believed that if they fell asleep, something was waiting for them. Something that wasn't just a nightmare, something that could actually kill them. And given the body count, they weren't exactly wrong. Now, the medical establishment largely sets aside cultural explanations. Spirits don't usually show up on autopsy reports. And that was a huge problem for doctors, because quite literally, nothing abnormal showed up in these reports. They tested for toxins, nothing. They looked at their diet. There was a theory that maybe heavy meals before bed might be involved, but that didn't hold up. And they considered stress, which is an obvious candidate given what these communities had survived, but stress alone doesn't stop a healthy heart in a 28-year-old. Every avenue they pursued led to the same wall. These men were continuing to die in a way that left no trace. But in 1984, something broke through. Not from the dead, but from survivors. 3 young Southeast Asian men were found suffering cardiac arrest. Paramedics reached them in the nick of time, and when they hooked them up to monitors, they saw it: ventricular fibrillation. The heart was quivering chaotically, pumping in a way that was incompatible with living. These men had no coronary artery disease, no structural heart problems, no reason on paper for their hearts to do what they had just done. And in the hospital, it happened again, repeating episodes of the same lethal arrhythmia. For the first time, researchers caught the killer in the act. They knew what was stopping these hearts, but why was this happening? The ventricular fibrillation finding should have been the beginning of the end of the mystery. In a lot of medical stories, that's how it works, right? You identify the mechanism, you trace it back to the cause, and you build a treatment. Case closed. But sudden, unexplained nocturnal death syndrome doesn't work like that. Researchers went back to the bodies. A major pathology study examined the hearts of 18 Southeast Asian refugees who had died in their sleep. And what they found was strange. Many of the hearts were enlarged, and nearly all of them showed abnormalities in the conduction system, the internal circuitry that tells the heart when to beat. There were extra pathways that shouldn't have been there and served no purpose. It's almost like their hearts had never been fully developed past the fetal stage. It's like they stopped maturing. On paper, this looks like an answer. A heart that works fine during the day but becomes vulnerable at night, when sleep shifts the body into a different physiological gear, when the nervous system toggles between states, when REM sleep sends adrenaline surging through a system that's supposed to be at rest. But it wasn't that clean. Having unusual cardiac wiring doesn't automatically mean you'll die from it. Millions of people walk around with conduction variants and never know. The anatomy alone couldn't explain why these men at this time were dying this way. But then, decades later, geneticists found something deeper. A subset of sudden, unexplained nocturnal death syndrome cases turned out to be linked to mutations in a gene called SCN5A, a gene which encodes sodium channels in the heart. The same gene implicated a condition called Brugada syndrome, a known cause of sudden cardiac death that strikes characteristically during rest or sleep. Your heart runs on electrical signals, little zaps that tell it when to beat, and some of those men had a mutation that they were born with that made those signals go haywire under the right conditions. And the most dangerous time for that to happen was when they were asleep, when the heart slows down and that faulty wiring had room to cause problems. And suddenly, the syndrome had a partial genetic fingerprint. In some families, it was Brugada syndrome, undiagnosed, unnamed, hiding in populations where routine cardiac screening didn't exist. But that's not the whole answer, because not every son's case points to Brugada. Not every victim carries a mutation. In some cases, mapped to sodium channels, some to conduction abnormalities, and some to mechanisms that nobody have been able to identify at all. And then there's the other piece, the one that makes doctors uncomfortable, because it doesn't show up on an EKG or a genetic sequence. It's just sleep itself. Sleep is not a quiet state. During REM, your nervous system can spike. During those micro-awakenings you don't even remember having, your automatic system shifts in ways that, for most people, mean nothing, but for some with the wrong cardiac substrate, those shifts can be the thing that tips it over. And if that same person has been avoiding sleep, if they're terrified, running on adrenaline and grief, and the kind of vigilance that gets baked into you by surviving a war, when sleep finally hits, it hits hard and fast. And when the bodies drop into that sleep, it may not be peaceful. This is the truth that medical communities eventually arrived at. It's a frightening one. There's no single cause, but there is a model. Inherited cardiac vulnerability plus stress and displacement as amplifiers and sleep as the trigger. That model explains a lot of cases, but not all of them. The syndrome has gotten smaller as pieces get reclassified into known genetic conditions, but it hasn't disappeared. As recently as 2014, a 16-year autopsy series from central China documented 49 sons' cases, young men dying in their sleep with no explanation at autopsy. Same profile, same pattern, same silence from the body after death. Whatever this is, it didn't end in the 1980s, it just stopped making headlines. The CDC's numbers did eventually come down. That death rate of 10.2 per 100,000 in 1981 had dropped to 1.1 by 1987. The peak was over, but nobody cured anything. The decline came because the most vulnerable window was closing. Those first years after arrival, when the stress and disruption were at their worst, the communities were stabilizing. People were finding their footing, and the cultural practices that had been severed by displacement, the rituals, the ceremonies, the spiritual infrastructure these communities had carried for generations, were slowly beginning to resume. But that underlying vulnerability, that was still there. written into the DNA of people who would never know they carried it unless something went wrong in the night. And for the survivors, the very few that were resuscitated from ventricular fibrillation, the only reliable protection turned out to be a defibrillator implanted in their chest, a device that would shock the heart back into a rhythm if it tried to kill them in their sleep. That's the best medicine could offer after decades of research, was a machine that sat inside your body and waited for the worst moment of your life so it could fight back on your behalf. But the story doesn't end with medicine, because while all this is happening, while the CDC was counting bodies and researchers were mapping arrhythmias, someone else was reading about these deaths. Someone who wasn't a doctor or a scientist, someone whose job was to find what scared people most and put it on a screen. That man from the beginning, the one who sat down with the Los Angeles Times and read a story he couldn't shake, that was Wes Craven. He read multiple articles about these deaths, small pieces in the LA Times about young Southeast Asian men dying in the middle of nightmares. But it was that one story, the boy who knew something was coming, who fought sleep and lost, that really stayed with him. It sat with him for about a year, and then he wrote a screenplay. That premise was borrowed almost directly from what he read. What if falling asleep could kill you? What if something was waiting for you in your dreams, and the only way to survive was to never close your eyes? He gave that thing in the dream a face, a burned man with a striped sweater and knives for fingers. Freddy Krueger. In 1984, the same year researchers published the first clinical proof that ventricular fibrillation was stopping these men's hearts in their sleep, New Line Cinema released A Nightmare on Elm Street. The movie became one of the most successful horror films ever made. It launched a franchise. It turned Freddy into a cultural icon, and almost nobody who watched it knew that the thing at its core, the idea that sleep is where you're most vulnerable, that the nightmare itself can kill you, wasn't invented. It was reported. The LA Times refugee stories were, in Wes's words, the center line of the film, not a loose inspiration, the narrative spine. A young person is afraid to sleep because something in their dreams will get them. They fight it, they lose, and they die. And that's exactly what was actually happening in apartments in Fresno and Long Beach and Minneapolis, to real people with real families who had already survived things most Americans couldn't imagine. The medical community called it sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome. Hollywood called it Freddy Krueger. And the distance between the two was a lot smaller than anyone in the theater ever realized. Somewhere in the early 1980s, a community of people who had already lost everything, their homes, their family, their communities, started losing their young men in the night, and nobody could tell them why. The doctors couldn't find it on the autopsy table, the geneticists wouldn't find it in the genome for another 20 years, and the people themselves had an explanation. An ancient one, rooted in spirits and sleep and forces that Western medicine didn't really take seriously. And while all this was unfolding, while families were burying sons and brothers and husbands who had gone to bed healthy and never woke up, a filmmaker in Los Angeles read about it in the newspaper and saw a monster. He wasn't wrong exactly. There was a monster. It just wasn't wearing a striped sweater. The real nightmare was quieter than that. It wasn't something you could see or run from. It didn't chase you down a hallway or wait for you in a dream. It was a heart that could betray you without a warning, a genetic inheritance you didn't know you had, a body that waited until you were at your most defenseless, asleep, dreaming, completely surrendered to the one thing every human being has to do, and then turned on you. Freddy Krueger became an icon. The franchise made hundreds of millions of dollars. Parents watched teenagers fight to stay awake and felt that safe kind of fear. The kind you feel in a dark theater when you know you're going to walk out at the end. But for families of the men who inspired it, staying awake wasn't a game. It wasn't even a strategy. It was the last thing their sons ever tried to do. And to this day, Sons hasn't been fully solved. The syndrome had been chipped away, pieces reclassified, genes identified, defibrillators implanted, but the whole picture has never really come into focus. People are still dying in their sleep in parts of Southeast Asia and beyond, and in some of those cases, the autopsy still comes back empty. The nightmare, it turns out, was never really on Elm Street. It was always in the bedroom, and for some people, it still is. Thanks Thanks for watching this video. I hope you stick around, and if you want to hear more of history's mysteries or life's disturbing discoveries, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications. You got anything you want to share with me? You got any weird stories? Leave it down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, I'll see you later. Bye.